This month, France marks the 60th anniversary of nuclear weapons tests that made the country one of the world's first nuclear powers. But critics claim more than 30 years of testing in Algeria and French Polynesia left many suffering from the effects of harmful radiation. On February 13, 1960, France held its first nuclear test in Algeria's southern Sahara Desert. Hooray for France, then French President Charles de Gaulle wrote at the time. But Jean-Claude Hervieux had other memories. He joined the French testing efforts in Algeria as an electrician. He remembers a nuclear test in 1962 that did not go according to plan. Radioactive dust and rock escaped from underground. Hervieux and others observing the testing ran for shelter. 2 French ministers were among them. The group washed themselves in a military housing area to decontaminate. France held more than 200 nuclear tests until a later president, Jacques Chirac, ended testing in 1996. Most tests took place in French Polynesia, but 17 took place in Algeria between 1960 and 1966, ending 4 years after Algeria's independence from France. Brahim Oumansour is a North Africa expert at the French Institute of International Relations in Paris. He said, "It's part of the whole issue of decolonization and Algerians in general asking for recognition of colonization crimes." He added that official recognition and financial compensation for the Algerian tests could cost millions of dollars. Hervieux spent 10 years working on nuclear test areas in Algeria and later French Polynesia. Now 80 and living in France's Lyon area, he says he is physically fine. But he used to receive some questionable radioactive testing results from the French government. Hollande Desbordes is a former French physicist and spokesman for an independent French atomic safety research group called CRIRAD. He has visited the Algerian test areas. Desbordes said he discovered very high radiation levels in some places. He believes the French government should release important information about the explosions. But he also blames Algerian officials for failing to correctly secure the desert testing areas. France's Nuclear Compensation Commission, CIVEN, said more than 1,600 claims have been filed under a 2010 French law that finally recognized health problems related to the testing. Only about 1/3 have met the requirements needed to receive financial benefits. The requirements include about 24 possible radiation-related cancers. Almost all the claims came from France and French Polynesia. Of the 51 claims from Algeria, only 1 has been compensated. CIVEN Director Ludovic Géron said the Commission can judge only the Algerian claims it receives. He said the sicknesses described in the few claims that did come in did not match the requirements for compensation. He added the Commission could not actively go out and search for other victims.
vacationers, nature lovers, and other people are using their cameras to document the effects of extreme high tides. By doing so, these men and women are helping scientists predict what rising sea levels will mean for coastal communities around the world. The volunteer photographers are taking pictures of an unusually high tide, the king tide. King tides take place about 2 times a year in coastal areas when the sun and Earth's moon align. The alignment increases the gravitational pull that produces the normal rising and falling of the sea. The volunteers' goal is to capture how high the waterline gets and where all the water goes. The volunteers then upload the images for use by scientists, policymakers, and even city planners. The pictures show where flooding affects some roads and offer clues as to whether it is safe to build new housing. The first of these king tide projects involving the public began in 2009 in Australia. The idea has since spread to coastal areas in the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Mauritius, and other nations. Flooding from king tides helps to show how rising sea levels will affect coastal communities, said Peter Ruggiero, acting chief of the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. He added that warmer ocean water and bigger storms could make those changes more intense. Skip Stiles is the executive director of a not-for-profit group called Wetlands Watch. It helped organize 700 people to document a king tide in the U.S. city of Norfolk, Virginia in 2017. For us, the king tide offers a look at where the water will be in about 2050, about 30 to 46 centimeters above normal levels, Stiles said. His group's efforts have since grown into a computer software program that uses crowdsourcing to gather images and find flooding. What we're finding is there's a real appetite for this data, he said. Some of the king tide projects are operating under the direction of nonprofit groups, while others work with state and local governments. They all have the same goal: to educate the public and provide a clear example of how climate change will affect everyday life. Marina Soros helped develop California's King Tides project. A lot of the conversation around climate change was what was happening far away and not about what people were going to be experiencing in their own lives, she said. The goal of the project was to get people thinking more about climate change locally instead of just polar bears. When Auckland, New Zealand, organized its first King Tide photo event, people shared pictures of flooded areas and roads with local government officials. Some of the images were used to develop a plan to build up a popular beach that was slowly being washed away. Last year, the group expanded the program to include a series of tide gauges that citizen scientists inspected, said Ben Sheeran, founder of the New Zealand King Tide Project. There's no eureka moment where it all comes into play, but it's an evolving database of information that's there when needed, he said. I'm John Russell.
2 years ago this month, a 19-year-old American shot and killed 17 people at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. 14 of the victims were students. The other 3 were teachers. The gunman was a former student at the high school. On this anniversary, as with other anniversaries of school shootings, Americans continue debating how to make sure students are safe in schools. On February 11th, a group called Everytown for Gun Safety released a report on one method for reducing gun violence at schools in the United States. Everytown is a not-for-profit organization. It joined with 2 labor unions in writing the report on school safety drills for active shootings. The 2 are the American Federation of Teachers, or AFT, and the National Education Association, NEA. The U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation defines an active shooter as an individual actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a populated area. To increase preparedness for such an event, many schools now hold active shooter drills for students and their teachers. The new report notes the possible harmful effects of such exercises. It urges school administrators to look for better ways to make schools safe and to prepare children for an active shooter. U.S. Department of Education numbers show how rare gun violence at schools is. Only 0.2% of about 36,000 gun deaths a year happen on school grounds. But almost all schools hold drills designed to prepare their employees and students for an active shooter. In fact, 40 states require such exercises. The report says one problem with the way schools carry out active shooter drills is how much they frighten students. When a school fails to inform parents and students about plans for a drill, parents cannot prepare their children, and the children may think that the attack is real. In some communities, the report says, schools deploy individuals who are told to act like masked gunmen. Students as young as 3 or 4 years old may be told to stay quiet in a small space for a long period of time. Experts on mental health say these experiences can have both short and long-term effects on how well the children behave in school, as well as on their physical and mental health. For example, after one drill in New Jersey, an 8th grade student reportedly said, "I was genuinely not sure if I would finish the day alive." Melissa Reeves is a former president of the National Association of School Psychologists. She said, "The drills may trigger either past trauma or trigger such a reaction that it actually ends up scaring the individuals instead of better preparing them to respond in these kinds of situations." There has been little research on how well the exercises prepare students for an active shooter. In 2007, one study found it better to prepare students for an intruder rather than a shooter. Another study noted the value of announcing drills in advance and following them with discussion. Students in that situation felt better prepared to handle possible violence. Surprise drills, on the other hand, can result in trauma to children. One woman in Arizona described the effect drills at her son's school had on him. He started biting his fingernails and refused to go anywhere alone. even to his room or a bathroom at home, he said. I'm Jill Robbins.
Welcome to The Making of a Nation, American History in VOA Special English. Americans experimented with many new customs and social traditions during the 1920s. There were new dances, new kinds of clothes, and some of the most imaginative art and writing ever produced in the United States. But in most ways, the 1920s were a conservative time in American life. Voters elected 3 conservative Republican presidents: Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. And they supported many conservative social and political policies. Kay Gallant and Harry Monroe continue the story of American conservatism during the 1920s.
One such policy concerned immigration. Most Americans in the 1920s had at least some ties through blood or marriage to the first Americans who came from Britain. Many people with these kinds of historic ties considered themselves to be real Americans, true Americans. Americans traditionally had welcomed newcomers from such Western European countries as Britain, France, or Germany. But most of the people arriving in New York City and other harbors in the 1920s were from the central, eastern, and southern areas of Europe. Some Americans became afraid of these millions of people arriving at their shores. They worried that the immigrant newcomers might steal their jobs, or they feared the political beliefs of the immigrants.
Pressure to control immigration increased following the World War. Congress passed a bill that set a limit on how many people would be allowed to enter from each foreign country. And the Congress and President Calvin Coolidge agreed to an even stronger immigration law in 1924. Under the new law, limits on the number of immigrants from each foreign country depended on the number of Americans who had families in that country. For example, the law allowed many immigrants to enter from Britain or France because many American citizens had families in those countries. But fewer people could come from Italy or Russia because fewer Americans had family members in those countries. The laws were very difficult to enforce, but they did succeed in limiting the number of immigrants from certain countries.
A second sign of the conservative feelings in the 1920s was the nation's effort to ban the sale of alcoholic drinks or liquor. This policy was known as prohibition because it prohibited or banned alcoholic drinks. Many of the strongest supporters of prohibition were conservative Americans living in rural areas. Many of them believed that liquor was evil, the product of the devil. A number of towns and states passed laws banning alcohol sales during the first years of the 20th century. And in 1919, the nation passed the 18th Amendment to the Federal Constitution. This amendment and the Volstead Act made it unlawful to make, sell, or transport liquor.
Prohibition laws failed terribly from the start. There was only a small force of police to enforce the new laws, and millions of Americans still wanted to drink liquor. It was not possible for the police to watch every American who wanted to buy a drink secretly or make liquor in his own home. Not surprisingly, thousands of Americans soon saw a chance to make profits from the new laws. They began to import liquor illegally to sell for high prices. Criminals began to bring liquor across the long unprotected border with Canada or on fast boats from the Caribbean islands. At the same time, private manufacturers in both cities and rural areas began to produce liquor, and shop owners in cities across the country sold liquor with little interference from local police. By the middle of the 1920s, it was clear to most Americans that prohibition laws were a failure. But the laws were not changed until the election of President Franklin Roosevelt in 1932.
A third sign of conservatism in the 1920s was the effort by some Americans to ban school books on modern science. Most of the Americans who supported these efforts were conservative rural Americans who believed in the traditional ideas of the Protestant Christian Church. Many of them were fearful of the many changes that had taken place in American society. Science became an enemy to many of these traditional religious Americans. Science seemed to challenge the most basic ideas taught in the Bible. The conflict burst into a major public debate in 1925 in a trial over Charles Darwin's idea of evolution.
British scientist Charles Darwin published his books The Origin of the Species and The Descent of Man in the 19th century. The books explained Darwin's idea that humans developed over millions of years from apes and other animals. Most Europeans and educated people accepted Darwin's theory by the end of the 19th century. But the book had little effect in rural parts of the United States until the 1920s. William Jennings Bryan led the attack on Darwin's ideas. Bryan was a rural Democrat who ran twice for president. He lost both times. But Bryan remained popular among many traditional Americans. Bryan told his followers that the theory of evolution was evil because it challenged the traditional idea that God created the world in 6 days. He accused scientists of violating God's words in the Bible. Bryan and his supporters called on local school officials to ban the teaching of evolution. Some state legislatures in the more conservative southeastern part of the country passed laws making it a crime to teach evolution theory.
In 1925, a young science teacher in the southern state of Tennessee challenged the state's new teaching law. The teacher, John Scopes, taught Darwin's evolution ideas. Officials arrested Scopes and put him on trial. Some of the nation's greatest lawyers rushed to Tennessee to defend the young teacher. They believed the state had violated his right to free speech, and they thought Tennessee's law against teaching evolution was foolish in a modern scientific society. America's most famous lawyer, Clarence Darrow, became the leader of Scopes' defense team. Bryan and other religious conservatives also rushed to the trial. They supported the right of the state of Tennessee to ban the teaching of evolution. The trial was held in the small town of Dayton, Tennessee. Hundreds of people came to watch. Religious conservatives, free speech supporters, newsmen, and others. The high point of the trial came when Bryan himself sat before the court. Lawyer Clarence Darrow asked Bryan question after question about the Bible and about science. How did Bryan know the Bible is true? Did God really create the earth in a single day? Is a day in the Bible 24 hours, or can it mean 1,000,000 years?
Bryan answered the questions, but he showed a great lack of knowledge about modern science. The judge found Scopes guilty of breaking the law. But in the battle of ideas, science defeated conservatism. And a higher court later ruled that Scopes was not guilty. The Scopes evolution trial captured the imagination of Americans. The issue was not really whether one young teacher was innocent or guilty of breaking a law. The real question was the struggle for America's spirit between the forces of modern ideas and those of traditional rural conservatism. The trial represented this larger conflict.
American society was changing in many important ways during the early part of the 20th century. It was not yet the world superpower that it would become after World War II, but neither was it a traditional rural society of conservative farmers and clergy. The 1920s were a period of growth